first time in decades, due to the Federal Reserve's abuse of power and manipulation of our currency, as well as Congressman Ron Paul's tireless efforts to persuade the Congress to audit it, the Federal Reserve is beginning to show some cracks in its once super secretive facade. Wednesday's New York Times reports that Ben Bernanke, the head of the Federal Reserve, has been schooled by, of all people, Congressman Barney Frank, the chair of the House Financial Services Committee, on how to handle the political scrutiny that he and the Fed are now under. At the same time, Senate Finance Committee Chair Senator Chris Dodd of Connecticut has proposed legislation that would strip the Fed of much of its unconstitutional and illegal regulatory authority, giving it, no surprise, to other federal bureaucracies, but still clipping the Fed's wings nevertheless. So what's going on here? Might the big government crowd suspect that hard times are coming for one of its sacred cows? Joining me now to discuss all this is Lew Rockwell, chairman of the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, and Peter Schiff, president of Euro-Pacific Capital and a candidate for the Republican nomination to be United States Senator from the state of Connecticut. Lew, first to you. Is the big government crowd in Washington getting word that, notwithstanding unbelievable opposition, notwithstanding efforts from politicians in his own party to water it down, Congressman Paul's H.R. 1207, the bill that would truly and ultimately and finally make the Fed transparent, just might arrive on the president's desk with a two-thirds majority from both houses?
Well, I'd love to believe that, Judge, but I think what's actually happening is that they're terrified that anybody is looking at them. I mean, really, for the first time since the Fed was established in 1913, this hugely dangerous and destructive bureaucracy is controversial. It never has been. It's always been boring, and that was a deliberate strategy. Now, thanks to Ron Paul, thanks to the work of the Austrian economists, thanks to all the spokesmen like Peter Schiff and others, we have this horrible agency is controversial, is being criticized, and they're scared the pants off Mr. Bernanke, and they're all afraid. So yeah, they're worried about actually changes in public opinion, because everybody knows the Fed is dedicated to bailing out the banksters, bailing out Wall Street at the expense of the average guy. And people may not know the details of how the Fed operates, but more and more Americans are suspicious of it. They don't like it. And as with any aspect of the government, if they lose popular approval,
right,
they lose their power.
Peter, you and I were talking before we started the show about how much regulatory authority the Fed has, which was never even lawfully given to it, which it just assumes by virtue of it being the 800-pound gorilla in the room.
I know, we get the worst of all worlds here. First of all, power that the Fed doesn't actually have, that it usurped, that it should be admonished for. It should have been restricted. Instead, now that power is being formally given to new government agencies that are going to abuse it even more, because after all, they're actually going to legitimately have the power. But of course, there's nothing in the Constitution that even gives the government the authority to give them that power. You know, the whole thing is ridiculous. Talk about that, the pot calling the kettle black. This whole thing is being orchestrated by Chris Dodd. Where was he? He was the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. He was overseeing Freddie and Fannie. He was overseeing the mortgage industry. He's saying that the Fed didn't do its job.
All right.
He didn't do his job either.
I know you're running against him, and you make a very compelling case as to why he doesn't belong in the Senate. But what is it that he is claiming that the Fed has done wrong? Why is this big government guy trying to take power away from the most super secret big government entity in the history of the country?
He probably thinks they didn't do enough. He thinks they're too focused on one aspect of the country, the monetary policy, that they shouldn't be focused on all these other things. And so he wants other government agencies to focus on them. In other words, he wants to basically make a super Fed, because he wants to make several different departments so that we can get killed from, you know, many different angles. And, as in your earlier segment, I mean, the regard for the Constitution. You talked earlier that they're going to require us to buy health insurance, right, and if we don't buy it, we get fined or go to jail. Well, if the government can fine us and jail us for not buying health insurance, then is there any limit on their power? Do we have any rights left? I mean, what do we got left in this country?
You know, Lew, earlier this week when I was filling in for Glenn Beck, our colleague and friend Tom Woods was on with me, and he reminded me of a very famous back and forth. And Peter, even you as a non-lawyer but an economist will be interested in this. A famous back and forth in oral argument in the Supreme Court between Justice Scalia and a lawyer for the Justice Department. And Justice Scalia says to the lawyer for the Justice Department, is there any area of human behavior that the Congress is unable to regulate? And the lawyer for the Justice Department was unable to come up with an answer. Question, have we gotten to the deplorable state of affairs that Jefferson predicted when he said if the Congress can define its own power, if the Congress determines the limits of what it can do, there will be no limit to what it can do?
Well, Judge, we have Jefferson's nightmare of a consolidated government that, yes, absolutely sees no limit to its powers. And I would say in de facto, in terms of what they call the law these days, there are no limits to its power, except among the people. And Chris Dodd is doing this because he is afraid, the Fed is afraid, Barney Frank is afraid that the Fed is losing its authority and losing its power because Americans are coming to hate its guts, which is a very good development. This is wonderful.
If Chris Dodd's bill becomes law, and I don't expect you to have read it, Lou, because it just came out this morning and it's about 1,200 pages, though knowing you will read it, which is more than can be said for the 535 people. Ron Paul will read it and a few of the others
I'm sure Chris
who
Dodd
have to
never
vote
read
on it. I can't imagine that Chris Dodd, whoever wrote it for him, would even read it. But should we rejoice that the Fed will lose some of its power, or is this Tweedledee versus Tweedledum?
Well, I think we can actually take both positions. The Fed is losing some of its power, but it's an attempt to protect the Fed. And yes, it goes to other federal agencies. But the fact that they're worried about the reputation of the Fed, the fact that they're worried about popular opposition to the Fed, is a great medal on Ron Paul's chest.
Can you imagine? And you're getting into the nitty-gritty and dirty fingernails of politics, Peter Schiff. Can you imagine being a fly on the wall while Barney Frank, of all characters, is counseling Ben Bernanke as to how to appear in public when the Fed is being criticized?
Well,
I mean, what are they worried about? What do Frank and Bernanke know will be revealed to the world if Congressman Paul's bill becomes law?
Well, what the Fed is actually doing. I mean, the whole fraud behind our monetary system, that our monetary system is based on nothing, that we just print worthless pieces of paper, that everything that the government is doing, this whole policy of stimulus and 0% interest rates is the cause of the problem. The government doesn't want the public to know that they're responsible for this mess. They want us to think that more government is going to cure the disease of too much government. And you're talking about the Fed losing power. How does it lose power it never had? Power it usurped. I think it's more dangerous to formally invest that power in these new agencies. And believe me, Dodd is creating 4 new government agencies. Who knows what these agencies are going to do? I mean, you're letting them loose. It's like taking cancer cells and putting them in the body of the country, and they're just going to start growing. Who knows? They're going to screw up everything. And believe me, my industry, I'm sure, is going to get regulated even more than it is now. We're already being regulated to death. The regulations are making the industry less competitive, less productive. And you know what they do? They protect these huge, too-big-to-fail firms from competition because they've got the economies of scale to handle all this regulation, but the small firms don't. And a lot of firms will never even get started because they can't handle the regulation.
Lou, what is the thinking from Congressman Paul about the efforts by a Republican senator from Tennessee and a Democratic colleague from, forgive me, I don't remember what state, to gut H.R. 1207 and make it a meaningless, only sort of show-like, but not truly transparent audit?
Well, I would say he's not surprised by it, but he's not giving up either. And he thinks that there is more and more popular support for what he's doing. And he also knows that what Americans want to find out is who did the Fed benefited? Who do they print up all this money for, both in terms of investment banks on Wall Street, other big banks in this country, and also international organizations, international banks? Who got what? So they're going to try to water down this bill. Maybe they will succeed in watering it down. Certainly, Obama would veto it were it ever to reach his desk. And I must say, I don't think with the Democrats in power, or for that matter, the Republicans in power, that it would ever get there with a veto-proof majority. But still, in the hearts and the minds of the American people, the Fed is being vetoed, and that scares the heck out of them in Washington.